Warning: this teaching is too powerful for most people to handle. There comes a moment in every sincere seeker's journey when words can no longer comfort, methods no longer satisfy, and beliefs no longer sustain. At that moment something deeper begins to stir, not as a voice, not as an emotion, but as an unmistakable awareness. This awareness does not shout, it does not persuade, it simply is. And because it does not align with human expectations, many turn away from it, calling it impractical, dangerous, or too extreme. This teaching is not powerful because it promises miracles. It is powerful because it removes the one who seeks them. It asks nothing of the personal mind, yet it takes everything the mind depends on for its sense of security. It does not tell you how to fix your life. It reveals that the life you have been trying to fix was never the source of your being in the first place. This is why most people cannot handle it, not because it is difficult, but because it is final. From the human perspective, we are trained to improve, to become better, to grow spiritually through effort and discipline. Yet this teaching quietly waits and then speaks a single truth: there is nothing to improve. The moment this is heard, not intellectually but inwardly, the entire structure of striving begins to collapse. The personal sense of, that has worked so hard to survive, suddenly finds no role to play. And this feels to many like loss rather than freedom. The inner presence does not enter human affairs to cooperate with fear, ambition, or self-will. It does not partner with the ego's plans. Instead, it dissolves the belief that you were ever separate from wholeness. This is unsettling to those who still need outcomes, signs, or proof. The mind asks, "What will happen to me?" while the presence quietly answers, "There is no separate to protect." When this truth begins to dawn, healing no longer comes as an event, supply no longer arrives as a surprise, peace is no longer dependent on circumstances. All of these are revealed as natural expressions of a consciousness that was never absent. The danger, if it can be called that, is that once this is seen, you cannot return to living as a seeker. You cannot unknow what has been revealed. And many are not ready for a truth that does not allow negotiation. This teaching requires stillness, not the stillness of the body, but the stillness of self-assertion. It requires the courage to let go of personal authority and allow a deeper intelligence to live your life as itself. For those who are ready, this is liberation. For those who are not, it feels like being stripped of identity, purpose, and control. And yet, this is not a teaching meant for the many, it never was. It is for the few who have exhausted every outer answer and are finally willing to rest in the silence where no questions remain. It is not meant to be understood, promoted, or defended. It is meant to be lived quietly, without display, without fear, and without the need for recognition. That is why it is too powerful for most people to handle, not because it demands too much, but because it leaves nothing of the false self behind. True spiritual power is rarely recognized because it does not announce itself through force, emotion, or visible authority. It does not arrive with signs, excitement, or dramatic transformation that the human mind can point to and claim ownership of. Instead, it reveals itself as a quiet awareness that remains unchanged regardless of circumstance. This power does not attempt to alter conditions on the surface of life, it rests beneath them, untouched and complete. The world has trained us to associate power with action, control, and visible results, so when something operates without effort or display, it is often dismissed as weakness or passivity. Yet the deepest power is never aggressive because it has nothing to oppose. It does not compete with appearances or argue with conditions, for it recognizes that appearances have no authority of their own. Stillness is misunderstood as inactivity, but in truth it is the absence of resistance. When the personal mind becomes quiet, not through discipline but through understanding, something greater begins to function naturally. This is not a trance or an altered state, but a clear awareness in which thought no longer dominates perception. In this stillness, life is not managed, it unfolds. Decisions are made without anxiety, actions occur without strain, and responses arise without premeditation. The personal sense of responsibility gradually loosens, not because one becomes careless, but because a deeper intelligence is recognized as already governing every detail. This intelligence does not need instruction, affirmation, or direction. It has always been present, operating long before the individual believed they were in control. Most people search for spiritual power because they want relief from fear, lack, illness, or confusion. They expect power to fix what appears broken. But true power does not repair the human sense of life, it exposes the unreality of the belief that life was ever broken. This realization is uncomfortable because it removes the familiar framework of effort and reward. The mind wants techniques, formulas, and assurances, yet stillness offers none of these. It simply reveals that peace is not produced but uncovered, and that harmony is not achieved but recognized. This recognition cannot be rushed because it does not occur in time. It dawns when resistance fades, when the need to control outcomes softens, and when the personal relaxes its grip. The reason this power is so subtle is because it does not belong to the individual. It cannot be used for personal gain or directed toward personal goals. The moment one tries to employ it, it recedes, because it was never an object to be handled. It functions only when the sense of separation dissolves enough for life to be lived rather than managed. In this way, stillness becomes the doorway through which reality expresses itself without obstruction. Words may describe it, but words cannot produce it. Practices may point toward it, but practices cannot contain it. When stillness becomes natural, fear loses its momentum. Problems no longer demand urgent solutions because the need to react has diminished. This does not mean challenges disappear, but their power to disturb is gone. What once seemed threatening is seen as transient movement within a larger wholeness. The individual no longer stands against life, attempting to bend it into shape, but stands within life, allowing its intelligence to reveal the next step. This is not resignation, it is trust without effort. It is confidence without assertion. It is strength without tension. Those who encounter this teaching often struggle because it asks for the surrender of identity, not behavior. It does not require moral improvement or spiritual achievement, it requires the willingness to stop claiming authorship over life. The ego fears this because it equates control with survival. Yet in the quiet recognition of a power that does not belong to the self, a different kind of security emerges, one that does not depend on circumstances, opinions, or outcomes. This is why true spiritual power remains hidden in stillness, because only those who are willing to let go of noise, effort, and personal authority can perceive what has always been present. Most people do not resist deep spiritual teaching because it is false or unreasonable. They resist it because it threatens the structure upon which their sense of self is built. The personal identity depends on effort, choice, control, and the belief that life is something to be managed. When a teaching quietly suggests that this entire framework is unnecessary, the mind reacts defensively. It is not the truth itself that feels dangerous, but what the truth seems to take away. The ego does not ask whether the teaching is real, it asks whether it will still have a role once the teaching is accepted. From early life, individuals are conditioned to believe they are separate entities navigating a world of forces outside themselves. Success is attributed to personal effort, failure to personal weakness, and safety to personal vigilance. This conditioning becomes so deeply ingrained that even spiritual seeking is often another form of control. The mind seeks techniques, affirmations, and practices that promise improvement while leaving the central identity intact. A teaching that points beyond the doer, beyond the thinker, and beyond the chooser feels like an attack on survival itself. The ego interprets surrender as annihilation rather than liberation. The resistance intensifies when the teaching refuses to offer substitutes. Many systems replace one authority with another, giving the mind something new to rely on. But this teaching offers no replacement for the personal sense of control. It does not promise that life will improve according to human standards, nor does it assure protection from discomfort. Instead, it invites a radical shift in perception in which the idea of a separate self gradually dissolves. For most people, this feels like stepping into emptiness without guarantees. The mind demands certainty, yet this truth provides none in the way the intellect understands it. Another reason for resistance is that this teaching cannot be validated by external results alone. The world values measurable progress, visible success, and clear outcomes. Inner surrender, however, often appears as doing less, striving less, and explaining less. To the observing mind, this can look like irresponsibility or avoidance. Yet what is actually occurring is the release of unnecessary struggle. Still, because there is no dramatic display, the ego dismisses the process as ineffective. It wants evidence before trust, while this teaching requires trust before evidence can be perceived. There is also fear of losing personal meaning. Many people define themselves through goals, achievements, and narratives about who they are and where they are going. When a teaching reveals that identity is a mental construction rather than a truth, it can feel as though one's entire story is being erased. The ego clings to its history, its wounds, and even its spiritual progress, because these give it a sense of continuity. Letting go of these narratives feels like becoming nothing. The irony is that only when these stories loosen does a deeper sense of being emerge, one that is not dependent on past or future. This resistance is not a failure or a flaw, it is a natural response of a mind that has been trained to survive through control. The teaching does not condemn this resistance, nor does it attempt to overcome it through force. It simply waits. When the exhaustion of effort becomes greater than the fear of surrender, the grip of ego begins to soften. At that point, the teaching is no longer heard as a threat, but as relief. What once seemed dangerous begins to feel inevitable. For those not ready, the teaching will always seem impractical, extreme, or detached from real life. They will search for ways to adapt it without losing control, to interpret it safely, or to intellectualize it into harmless concepts. But for those who have reached the limits of self-effort, The very thing that once felt terrifying becomes the doorway to peace. The teaching does not force acceptance, it simply reveals what has been quietly true beneath all resistance. The most unsettling aspect of this teaching is that it does not aim to improve the human sense of life, but to gently expose its limitations until it is no longer taken as reality. From the perspective of the personal mind, life appears to be a series of problems to solve, conditions to manage, and circumstances to overcome. Spirituality is often approached as a way to make this process smoother, more successful, or more comfortable. Yet this teaching moves in an entirely different direction. It does not promise a better, managed existence. It reveals that the one attempting to manage existence was never the true source of life in the first place. The presence within does not enter human experience to assist the ego in fulfilling its plans. It does not reinforce personal identity or strengthen the sense of separation. Instead, it dissolves the belief that identity was ever confined to a body, a history, or a name. This is why the teaching feels so radical. It does not work alongside the personal self, it replaces the false premise upon which the personal self is built. What disappears is not life, but the illusion of ownership over life. The human mind interprets this as loss, because it equates control with existence. When this inner presence begins to be recognized, there is often a period of confusion. The familiar motivations that once drove behavior lose their urgency. Fear no longer provides the same fuel, and ambition loses its grip. This can feel like emptiness or disorientation because the old reference points are gone. The mind wants to reassert itself, to find a new role, a new identity, or a new spiritual position. But the presence does not negotiate. It does not offer the ego a refined version of itself. It simply continues to reveal its own completeness, making the personal sense of self increasingly unnecessary. This replacement is not an act of force. Nothing is taken away violently or suddenly. The process unfolds through awareness rather than effort. As attention shifts inward, it becomes clear that peace does not arise from controlling circumstances, but from resting in what is already whole. The belief that, I am the doer, gradually weakens not because it is fought against but because it is seen to be false. Actions still occur, responsibilities are still met, and life continues in practical ways, but the weight of personal authorship is gone. Life is lived rather than carried. Many misunderstand this teaching and assume it leads to passivity or withdrawal. In truth, it leads to a different kind of engagement, one that is free from anxiety and self-protection. When the false self no longer needs to be defended, actions become more precise and appropriate. There is less interference from fear and desire, and more responsiveness to the moment as it is. The presence does not remove functionality, it removes friction. It does not erase individuality in expression, but it dissolves the belief in separation that made individuality feel fragile. The reason this teaching is so difficult to accept is because it offers no compromise. It does not say the ego can remain in charge while being guided by something higher. It reveals that the ego was never truly in charge to begin with. This is deeply threatening to the personal mind, which has spent a lifetime trying to secure itself through effort, knowledge, and achievement. To hear that all of this was based on a misunderstanding can feel unbearable. Yet within this realization lies an unexpected freedom, because the burden of maintaining an imaginary self is finally lifted. As this truth deepens, life begins to reorganize itself naturally. There is less struggle against what is, and less effort to become something else. The inner presence does not correct human life, it absorbs it into a larger reality where nothing is missing and nothing needs to be protected. What remains is not a diminished existence, but a quieter, steadier way of being in which the false sense of self has gently faded into irrelevance. Healing, supply, and peace are commonly approached as goals to be reached sometime in the future, dependent on effort, faith, or favorable circumstances. From this viewpoint, life appears incomplete in the present moment, always waiting for something to change before wholeness can be experienced. This belief subtly reinforces the idea that lack is real and that fulfillment exists outside of now. The teaching challenges this assumption at its root by revealing that what is sought has never been absent. Healing is not something that arrives, it is the recognition that wholeness was never broken. Supply is not something that comes and goes, it is the continuous expression of an infinite source already functioning. Peace is not produced by resolving conditions, it is the natural state uncovered when resistance ceases. The human mind is conditioned to believe that problems are real entities requiring solutions. Illness appears as a condition that must be overcome, lack as a deficit that must be filled, and unrest as an emotional state that must be managed. Yet these appearances gain their power from belief, not from substance. When consciousness identifies itself with form, limitation seems unavoidable. The moment attention shifts from appearances to the deeper awareness beneath them, the authority of these conditions begins to dissolve. This does not mean the body or circumstances instantly change, but it means they are no longer interpreted as indicators of truth. What changes first is perception, and perception determines experience. Healing in this light is not an event but a realization. The body is no longer seen as a vulnerable mechanism operating on its own, but as an expression within a greater intelligence. Fear, which once fueled disease, loses its foundation when the belief in separation weakens. The struggle to force the body into health often prolongs tension, while quiet recognition allows balance to reassert itself naturally. This recognition cannot be commanded or visualized into existence. It arises when the effort to fix gives way to the awareness of completeness already present. The same principle applies to supply. When supply is viewed as external and limited, life becomes a constant negotiation with uncertainty. The mind calculates, worries, and strategizes, reinforcing the belief that resources are scarce and must be secured through personal effort. This belief creates strain, not abundance. Recognition reveals that supply is not an object moving toward or away from the individual, but a flow inherent in being itself. When identity shifts from a separate self to conscious awareness, the sense of lack begins to loosen. Needs are met, not because they are demanded, but because they arise within a system that is already whole. Peace, perhaps more than healing or supply, exposes the misunderstanding most clearly. People attempt to manufacture peace by arranging circumstances, avoiding discomfort, or controlling relationships. These efforts provide temporary relief at best, because they address effects rather than cause. True peace does not depend on silence, safety, or agreement. It emerges when the inner struggle against life ends. This struggle is rooted in the belief that something essential is missing and must be acquired. When this belief is seen through, peace reveals itself as the background of all experience, unaffected by events. The difficulty lies in the fact that recognition feels too simple for the mind to accept. The intellect wants processes, progress, and proof. It distrusts what does not involve effort. Yet effort is precisely what keeps fulfillment appearing distant. The more one tries to achieve wholeness, the more one reinforces the assumption of lack. Recognition does not mean ignoring human needs or denying appearances. It means no longer granting them ultimate authority. Life continues to function, but it is no longer interpreted through fear or urgency. As this understanding deepens, the relationship to experience changes. Challenges may still appear, but they are not personalized. Conditions arise and pass without defining identity. There is less attachment to outcomes and less anxiety about timing. Healing unfolds as alignment rather than correction. Supply appears as movement rather than accumulation. Peace remains steady even when circumstances fluctuate. None of these are created by the individual. They are uncovered as natural expressions of a consciousness that was never incomplete. The intellect is designed to analyze, categorize, compare, and conclude, and within its proper domain it performs these functions well. It can learn facts, apply methods, and improve skills, but it cannot touch the depth this teaching points toward. When the intellect approaches spiritual truth, it tries to grasp it the same way it grasps information, by turning it into concepts that can be stored, repeated, or explained. This is where the difficulty begins, because what is being revealed is not an idea to be understood, but a reality to be yielded to. The intellect wants clarity in the form of definitions, while this truth offers clarity only through surrender. Surrender is often misunderstood as passivity or weakness, but it is neither. It is the release of the false assumption that the personal mind is the source of life, wisdom, or direction. The intellect resists this release because its very existence depends on being the decision-maker and interpreter. When it encounters something it cannot measure or control, it either tries to dominate it or dismiss it. This teaching leaves no room for domination because it does not respond to effort. The more the intellect pushes, the more distant the truth seems, not because it has moved away, but because the pushing itself obscures it. Living this truth requires a different orientation, one in which attention shifts from thinking about life to being present within it. This shift cannot be forced by willpower or reasoning. It happens when the constant commentary of the mind quiets enough for awareness to recognize itself. In that recognition there is no sense of achievement or accomplishment. Nothing has been added. Something has simply been set aside. The intellect finds this deeply frustrating because it cannot take credit for what it did not do. There is no mental milestone to point to, no conclusion to draw, and no certainty to claim ownership of. Because the intellect cannot lead this process, it must learn to rest. This resting is not a mental technique, but a willingness to stop insisting on answers. When questions lose their urgency, a deeper knowing begins to function. This knowing does not speak in words or thoughts, yet it is unmistakably clear. It guides action without explanation and resolves situations without argument. The intellect may observe this and try to understand how it happened, but any attempt to recreate it through thought immediately brings back effort and tension. The reason surrender feels so difficult is because the intellect equates control with safety. It believes that if it is not actively managing life, something will go wrong. Yet this belief itself is the source of anxiety. When surrender begins, there is often a period where the mind feels unmoored, as though it has lost its grip. This can be mistaken for confusion or emptiness, but it is actually the loosening of a habit that was never necessary. As trust deepens, a different sense of stability emerges, one that does not depend on constant mental activity. Living this truth does not mean abandoning reason or ignoring practical responsibilities. The intellect still functions, but it no longer sits on the throne. It becomes a tool rather than a master. Decisions are informed by thought but not driven by fear. Actions arise from clarity rather than compulsion. The intellect may not understand why a certain step feels right, but it no longer needs to. Its role shifts from control to cooperation. Those who try to approach this teaching purely through study often remain on the surface. They may speak eloquently about surrender while still secretly directing every outcome. The truth does not respond to such strategies. It reveals itself only when there is a genuine willingness to let go of authorship. This willingness cannot be manufactured. It arises naturally when the exhaustion of mental effort becomes undeniable. At that point, surrender is no longer a spiritual idea, but a practical relief. What makes this teaching so challenging is not that it demands intellectual effort, but that it renders intellectual effort irrelevant. It invites a way of living in which understanding is replaced by trust, and explanation is replaced by presence. The intellect may never be satisfied with this, but life itself responds immediately when resistance ends. Those who encounter this teaching often feel unsettled because it quietly withdraws their dependence on external authority. From the beginning of life, people are trained to look outside themselves for guidance, validation, and reassurance. Parents, teachers, institutions, traditions, and even spiritual leaders are assigned the role of knowing better, seeing farther, and deciding what is right. This conditioning creates a sense of safety, but it also reinforces the belief that wisdom exists somewhere else and must be accessed through permission or instruction. When a teaching points inward instead of outward, this entire structure begins to weaken, and with it the comfort of being directed. The discomfort does not come from being asked to rebel against authority, but from being invited to outgrow it. External authority provides clear rules, expectations, and consequences. It tells the individual what to believe, how to act, and what success looks like. Inner authority, by contrast, offers no such framework. It does not issue commands or guarantees. It functions quietly, often contradicting established norms and personal preferences. This requires a level of trust that many are not prepared to give, because it removes the familiar safety net of obedience and conformity. For those who have relied heavily on outer guidance, the shift inward can feel like abandonment. The mind asks, if I am no longer following someone or something, how will I know I am right? This question reveals the deeper fear of making mistakes without someone else to blame or credit. External authority absorbs responsibility, while inner authority returns it to awareness itself. This feels risky because it eliminates excuses. Life is no longer something that happens to the individual under someone else's control. It becomes an expression unfolding from within. Another reason this teaching unsettles people is that it cannot be standardized. Institutions thrive on uniformity, shared language, and agreed-upon interpretations. Inner authority, however, is personal and experiential. It does not conform neatly to doctrine or system. Two individuals may live from the same inner source yet express it in entirely different ways. This makes the teaching difficult to organize, regulate, or transmit through traditional means. For those who value structure and predictability, this lack of form feels threatening, as though order itself is being undermined. The teaching also removes the comfort of comparison. When authority is external, progress can be measured against others. One can feel advanced or behind, correct or mistaken, based on visible markers. Inner authority offers no such benchmarks. Growth becomes invisible, and validation must come from alignment rather than approval. This can feel isolating at first, because the familiar feedback loops are gone. The individual must learn to trust a sense of rightness that cannot always be explained or defended. What makes this especially challenging is that inner authority does not elevate the personal ego. It does not say, "You know better than everyone else." In fact, it often humbles the personal self, revealing how much effort was spent seeking permission rather than listening. The authority that emerges is not personal opinion but quiet discernment. It does not argue, prove, or persuade. It simply recognizes when something aligns and when it does not. This subtlety is easy to overlook and easy to doubt until it is lived. As dependence on outer authority fades, relationships with teachers, teachings, and traditions naturally change. Respect may remain, but reliance does not. Guidance may still be appreciated, but it is no longer followed blindly. This shift can create tension, both internally and externally, because it challenges established roles. Those who are comfortable being led may feel lost, while those accustomed to leading may feel threatened. The teaching does not attempt to resolve this tension. It allows it to surface and dissolve on its own. Ultimately, what unsettles people most is the realization that no one else can live life for them, decide truth for them, or carry their awareness. This recognition removes dependency but also removes illusion. It leaves the individual standing alone in consciousness, yet paradoxically more connected than ever before. The discomfort arises not because something essential has been taken away, but because something false is no longer available to lean on. What this entire teaching ultimately reveals is not a new belief system, method, or spiritual identity, but the quiet undoing of everything that depended on separation, effort, and control. It does not ask the individual to become better, wiser, or more spiritual. It invites the individual to see through the illusion of being the one who must manage life at all. This is why it feels so confronting and why it remains inaccessible to those still seeking reassurance from outcomes, authority, or understanding. The power of this message lies in its simplicity and finality. It offers no ladder to climb and no future state to reach, only the recognition of what has always been present beneath striving. As resistance softens, life begins to reveal a different rhythm, one not driven by fear or ambition but by quiet alignment. Healing supply and peace cease to be pursuits and are seen as natural expressions of a wholeness that was never interrupted. The intellect relaxes its grip, authority turns inward, and the personal sense of authorship fades without loss. What remains is not emptiness but clarity, not passivity but ease, not isolation but a deeper connection that requires no explanation. This teaching does not belong to the many because it offers nothing to hold on to. It belongs to those who are willing to let go, to rest in stillness, and to trust what cannot be proven. When that trust dawns, life no longer feels like a burden to carry or a problem to solve. It is simply lived quietly, effortlessly, and whole.